Oakley. Thank you for joining us for our conversation on the climate. So we are in South and here in Santos at Lab Procomum. And I wanted to start by asking where you're from, who you are, and why you're here. So maybe we can start with Saleen, please.
Well, thank you for having me. My name is Saleen Chapman, and I am with the Climate Works Foundation. It is a foundation that's based in the United States. That's where I live. And it's really working to address the climate crisis. And most of our grant making is in the global south. And we're working to sort of try to even increase our portfolio here as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Robin Oakley with the UMI Fund. That's the Urban Movement Innovation Fund. Based in the UK and the US myself, and the UMI Fund is focused on building people power to help drive forward faster and fairer climate solutions. So again, very focused on funding in the global south and focused on funding people.
Hi, I'm Kudzayi Ngwerume, and I'm also with the UMI Fund. I am based out of Marseille, France, but I am from Zimbabwe. And I work alongside Robin, mainly focusing on our shifting narratives work around raising voices from the global south, as well as our youth climate movement work. Happy to be here.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with a really easy question. You know that we are having G20 in Brazil this year, and next year we're going to have COP at Belém. And one of the proposals of the Brazilian government, I don't know if you're aware of, but Brazilian government brought the Nobel of Economy here to Brazil to make a tour. And what Brazilian government wants is to take the proposition of wealth taxation for climate financing. And I would like to know, how is this discussion on your organizations and communities where you come from? Is this a discussion? Because, of course, Brazilian government is, I think Lula has a quite international, let's say, open doors, but we're not that important in the discussion, although we do have a lot of billionaires as well. But I would like to know, do you think this is a conversation that is kind of moving? Is this something we should be aiming for the next years, or is this too unreal? You can start again with Saleen.
Lucky me. Yeah, well, I'll start by speaking about it from the U.S. context, and then I'll offer my thoughts on what Brazil might consider. So in the U.S., it is a popular proposal in sort of progressive political circles. It has yet to gain the level of momentum to actually sort of be a viable climate strategy, or at least one that we see being feasible in the short term. And, I think there at home, it sort of highlights the difference between what is sort of political rhetoric to sort of either distract or to galvanize people around a particular political cause, but that actually isn't going to deliver that outcome, versus something that's actually sort of designed to sort of move an issue forward or address a particular problem. And so for Brazil, I think if there is momentum to do that in a real way, I think that could sort of be a really powerful signal to the rest of the world that you all are responding to this crisis with a level of urgency, and believe that, a critical part of that is sort of the redistribution of resources, understanding that inequity is what drove this crisis in the first place. But just also sort of be mindful that sometimes these tools are about political rhetoric to support a particular candidate or a particular idea, and actually isn't in service of addressing the issue. And so just being vigilant about that is most important.
I can add a little bit. I think in addition, there's a couple of things happening, right? One is the question of taxation and the appropriate sources of funding for programs, ultimately government programs. And the second is how to drive finance towards specific pieces of programmatic work like climate adaptation or climate justice. In the European context, which is what I'm personally familiar with, there's a movement of wealthy individuals who are calling for themselves to be taxed more appropriately. And I think that's not the majority, but that shows that there's an underlying philosophical question here. And as Saleen says, there's a progressive idea that is taxing wealth is appropriate in order to drive forward social goods. But I think there's another piece here, which is the implementation of whatever that finance is delivering has to be for the benefit of the people most affected. And if the finance is going towards programs that aren't inclusive and aren't addressing questions of equity, questions of justice, and basic services for people, then in a way the conversation has missed the point. So I, personally strongly support, and I think there is room for finding novel sources of tax income to allow government programs to be funded. But it's just as important that the people affected are in the driving seat, shaping what those programs look like when they're delivered.
I think my experience is slightly different in that when we talk about tax specifically from a Southern African context, we also have to think about illegal financial flows, right? So there has been an active movement around where the money of the wealth is sitting, and often it's not sitting on our continent at all. It's sitting in bank accounts overseas, offshore. So the idea that these mechanisms, I think at the end of the day, while they might sit well on paper, it's about how do you actually make it a reality in the country in which you're working on. And a lot of the African countries at the moment, the other flip side that we're having to deal with is obviously the issue of debt, and how we look at debt and tax in the same conversation. I think kind of adding to what has already been said, in particular to what Saleen was saying, when you kind of go from, is this rhetoric or is this actually something that can actually be implemented? I think it's important that maybe from the grassroots or the community level that we're building on what has already been done in some of these other areas. And I think it's important that the climate movement is collaborating with people who have been working on the idea of like how we can address debt relief in conjunction in the conversation around corruption and bad governance. So, I think there is opportunity, but it is important that we're not doing it as a separate and parallel process, but we're working in an integrated way to kind of come to a solution.
Okay, yeah. But the thing is, I think what we've seen, at least in Brazil, with the Amazon Fund and a lot of, promises, that the money that was promised from the global north is not coming, not even 80%. And then when it comes, we have data that shows that only 0.6%, for example, is going to indigenous communities, right? So 0.6 is really small. And last year we went to the Shift the Power Summit in Bogota, which is like a number of organizations in philanthropy working with, this notion of shifting the power. It was my first time. And I thought a lot about, one of the criticisms that not only me, a lot of us had from the summit was that it's always us, the same people, kind of saying, okay, shift the power, but where's the money going, And including this discussion of wealth taxation, right, is still on a really high level of, government and these international treaties. And I wonder, how can we make this discussion closer to us, right? Where we've been speaking a lot just kind of days of filling the gap between the local and global movements and funders, what is really possible and you think in terms of shifting the power? Is it possible? And can we make them pay? Because still, I have to say, most killings in Amazon forest, not only in Brazil, but the whole Amazon, are connected to multinationals from the same countries that then give money to the Amazon. But we know all our contradictions, right? And this is the reality. What do we do from there so that we don't become cynical? As Saleen was saying, the rhetorics, they work like that. And, institutional politics can be really a theater of, rhetorics. But we know, has anything changed that you can feel, here we can find some ways of going out of this corner? And I'll start with Kudzayi now.
I mean, I think we've been through a lot in the last few years. I think that the trust has, it's always been a very delicate balance between, I think, particularly the global north and their commitments, and then what actually happens in reality. And we know that COVID really shattered what was left of a very fragile trust agreement, I think, in terms of how the world, the global north, decided to resource, vaccines and programs and protections and prioritize lives in the north versus how we could do something on a global solidarity level. But I think at the same time, what became clear, I think, from the global south perspective, and I'm speaking honestly from sub-Saharan African perspective, was that we cannot wait for that to come. If we are waiting for the money to eventually reach the bank account, to eventually go to the right program and address the right thing, many of our people would have already been dead at that point. So I think this idea of do we need to shift the power, or is it more about spotlighting where the power already exists? I think that for me is a more interesting conversation to have, because if you're saying you shift the power, it almost feels like you have no power to begin with, and you need to kind of do a whole thing. Whereas I think this entire week we've been together with you in Santos for the South by South, we've been realizing that the power is there, the solutions are there, the work is being done. So it's more about how to build that interconnectedness and to spotlight that and to really surface it in a way where decision makers can take notice.
I really agree with what Kudzayi is saying, and I think this gathering South by South shows that there's power from within, power from solidarity, power from mutuality and sharing and supporting one another. There are other power imbalances out there, and there's certainly injustice and inequity in the world. One of the challenges is talking about funders, and usually funders means philanthropy, or potentially it means government finance. But just thinking about philanthropy is, on one level, the system is, self-examining, self-reflecting, and saying we need to make changes. Our strategy is flawed because it's not inclusive enough. Some of the structures we have are getting in the way of the things we want to achieve as philanthropies. But at the same time, the fundamentals are also part of the problem. The existence of philanthropy and the economic system in which it comes about are part of the challenges that we're trying to address. So there's a changing the system versus working within the system tension going on there. And so I think for social movements, that's why the power from within and the mutual support is so important, which is not to say that securing better funding, getting more money to the groups that most need it is off the table. Absolutely not. But recognizing that will never be the complete answer to the question and won't be the end of the story, but it's something to be achieved in the pursuit of a better goal, which is to build the power from within and build the representation and inclusion of those communities in the bigger conversation. So I think philanthropy can be shifted. And I think there are many actors within the philanthropic space who are very keen to do that and working hard to build the evidence, to build the trust, to build the confidence, get over the fear that many funders have of working with social communities and social groups. But that will only get us so far. And I think the groups themselves need to recognize their own power and go beyond it.
Yeah, as I was listening to the other comments, I was reflecting on sort of the cycle of policymaking. And I think as stakeholders broadly, there's sort of the very visible process of the negotiation, the formalization of a particular policy and initiative. But I think what we sometimes forget is that we exist in a technocratic state. And so what happens is that once it's formulated into a document, it goes off into this black box where very technical, jargon-specific folks go and take that idea and make it in a way that you can no longer understand it. And so when we talk about climate finance, right, the idea of moving money from the global north to the global south was a great idea. It was something that I think broadly everyone supported. But then it went into a black box, and all these mechanisms and financial knowledge and aid jargon comes into play, then you no longer understand what were we actually trying to do in the first place. And so, I take that as a call to action as someone who works in philanthropy, that it's important for us to make sure that, yes, we need to make sure that we are resourcing and helping activate the work that is happening in the global south, but we cannot allow that to then fall into the realm of performative equity, because we know, and ultimately to achieve equitable outcomes, there's a lot of work to do to hold accountable leadership in the global north, and we need to make sure that we don't lose sight of that as well.
Yeah, nice. So I think we're saying that, trying to summarize here, it is possible, but we have a lot of work to do. And I think works are both ways, right? So we need champions like you inside the structures that are heard from a different perspective than organization, because you're funders. So you are opening up spaces inside, and we at the same time are open up spaces here, also kind of moving around within our powers. And I think for me, especially, one of my dreams was with this meeting was to actually have this kind of conversations where we could think together, because I have a lot of anguish when we just us in the room, so only civil society, for example, or when I go to only funders meeting, because there's always a part of the conversation missing. And then my feeling is that we're always kind of talking to ourselves and like echoing, and this gives me a lot of anguish. And I think this is one of the anguish I felt when I was at Shift the Power, because it was only like 2 foundations and then 700 community organizations, And and I think that tomorrow we're going to have funders here, and I'm looking forward to also like spreading up these conversations, because in the end, and this is something I say a lot here, when we are doing policy work and we bring people from, for example, public servers, is that we also have to see the humanity of people inside the big structures. Because when we say funders, there's a big, right, funders, and then when I say Saleen, when I say Robin and Kudzayi, then there's something else. And I think for me, this is we also been all of us saying that in these past days about trust, right? About, knowing we are people. So I think maybe my final question, so that we don't get too much to add it later, is what message would you want to leave for both funders and social movements, or any insights that we've been gaining these past few days that you would like to pass ahead today? You can start with Robin.
Thank you. I think there's a couple of things. One is about understanding that trust requires patience, and patience is about recognizing that one side or another, if there are 2 sides, often wants to go faster than the counterpart is able to do. And that might be, we need the money now because this is urgent, and some very ancient sort of structure inside of philanthropy means they can't move money quickly enough. On the other hand, often it's like, here's a political opportunity, we need to mobilize, where are the movements? And of course, movements require time to organize and to build solidarity. And I think patience and understanding of the constraints and the realities of how both funders and social movements operate is an important first step. And that's one that I think is very achievable for individuals, but it's much harder for institutions. So we need to think about getting that mutual understanding of how we work. And I think the second is around using that trust to build collaborative approaches. If we can agree on the vision that what we're trying to do is make sure that social movements have the resources to be safe, to be well, and to succeed, then that's a challenge we can all work on. So let's see it as a collaborative challenge rather than, a performative exercise of, here's my proposal, I approve or I disapprove. It's much more, how do we build together something that works?
I think for me, one of the big things that I'll take away from this is, I think on time, we've been talking for 3 years. I think 3.5 years. It took 2.5 years to start something, and then it took a year to do this. And so that just goes into showing how long that has taken, and we've gone back and forth. But I think critically alongside that is to have the patience and the time to actually build the appropriate containers to have these conversations. I don't think they can happen anywhere at any time. We'll probably all be at a climate meeting very soon in a few weeks somewhere, and we won't be able to have the same discussion even if we were all in that room. So I think that trying to understand, I think specifically as funders, as for us, UMI Fund as a donor collaborative, about how we actually make the case to build these containers and to ensure that these conversations can happen in a way where people don't feel like they're out of a place or they have to perform or do something is really, really critical. And I just want to say that I really admire the team here for all the thoughtfulness that has gone into it, everything from the care practice, from just how we're moving from a conversation to experimentation, everything feels welcome. And I think that is really, really valuable. And we often lose that as we try to come up with endless amounts of strategies and documents that need to be submitted. And then as you were saying, get filed away in some kind of black hole. And then I would say the last one, is just for us to continue to remember the power of global solidarity. I know we're here as the Global South convening, but we know from the past and all the powerful movements that have changed our lives that there was this interconnectedness from the South to the North. It's just balancing that relationship and ensuring that the Global South also has an equitable place on the table.
Well, it's hard to follow those comments. A few things I'll add is one, we need to embrace complexity, both in the individual level, understanding that when we enter into a space, we are all bringing much more than what we are showing on the surface. And I think going back to your comments about like connecting as humans and remembering that is really important and making space for that. And what struck me was even in some of our conversations this week, that even now, even showing up in this space, there are participants here who are very much thinking about very acute, immediate crises that are happening back at home, and understanding that when we talk about some of these ideas, sometimes we talk about it as a very simple solution of like, oh, we just need to move money from X place to Y place. But oftentimes, so we look for the simple solution because that's the one that we feel most comfortable with, instead of like looking for the more complex one, because ultimately that's what opens up the most possibilities. And then the last comment I'll say is that, really uplifting what you all brought into this week, which is this practice of collective care, understanding that we all have a role to play and that we have to be agile enough that we can take the labor off of someone when they need it. So if someone's showing up and they're responding to immediate crises, then they need to be able to set down some of the strategizing work, and there are others there who can sort of pick that up. There's going to be some folks who can actualize an idea in a given moment. There's going to be some folks who can sort of be in strategizing mode, and we have to be agile enough in our partnerships to do that. And then the last thing in terms of collective care is really like the power of culture, right? The power of someone cooking you a meal and holding you that way was one of the most powerful experiences I had from this week. And I think we forget how impactful really small things are. But I know that that's something that has always been key to social movements. And I think us institutions, particularly philanthropy, forget that sometimes.
Isa was looking, like, yeah, thank you. Yeah, just to say that we have a publication on care, and one of the things it says is small gestures. So how the importance of small gestures for the collective, and I think many times we all forget this because life is really hectic, right? So I thank you again for your openness and for just the connection that we've been sowing here this week, and hopefully we can gain the momentum for when we go back home and contagiously with other people more and more in. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you.